morning. Good morning to those of you listening in online as well, those of you here in Washington. Hey, if you're new around here, if maybe this is your very first time at Bethany, I just want to especially take a second to welcome you. My name's Noah. I'm one of the pastors around here, and we are in a series right now called What Made Jesus Mad? It's going to lead us all the way into Easter next week. And I've got an invitation and a challenge for you both as we approach arguably the most important Sunday on our calendar, especially if you consider Bethany to be your church home. Certainly, I want to invite you to be here next Saturday evening or Sunday morning at your campus to celebrate Easter with your family. But more than that even, we want to have a special night of worship together on Good Friday at 7 p.m. at our Vincennes campus. And here's the thing. I think sometimes we can rush past the cross on the way to the empty tomb. Like, I think it's really easy for us to head into Easter Sunday and the bright colors and the celebration and the joy and the hope that Jesus brings. But I think also it's really important, and Easter should be a time of celebration, don't get me wrong. But I think it's also important along the way to take the time to pause and acknowledge what it was that Jesus had to endure on the cross to bring about the freedom and the hope that we get to have. I think some introspection is equally important to celebration. And so I want to invite you to be there at Vincennes. All three campuses are going to come together for a time of worship there on Good Friday at 7 p.m. That's your invitation. My challenge for you then is that you would identify somebody in your life who you know is living outside of the light of Christ in their life and invite them to be with you here on Easter. And take the time even to maybe write a handwritten note, maybe make some cookies or set up a gift basket, get a gift card maybe to a local restaurant and accompany it with a note and the service time that you plan to attend, and invite someone, make a bold invitation to somebody who you know is living outside of the light of Christ, or they're disconnected from his church, to come and hear what God has for them here on Easter. And I want to say that, like, for us to do that, for us to be willing to make a bold invitation to somebody to come and experience what God has for them, to welcome those who are far from God to come near to him, that is not just a nice thing for us to do. But if we call ourselves a Christian, if we claim to believe in Jesus, then that is literally the call of Christ on our life. That we would go out of our way to welcome those who are far from God or have never had a relationship with him, or who are disconnected from his community, his church, back towards a relationship with him that can change everything for them. That's literally the call of Christ on our life. And if we're having a conversation about what made Jesus mad, if we're in a series of conversations about that, then you guys got to recognize, we have to recognize, man, Jesus was passionate about welcome. Jesus was passionate about welcome. In fact, possibly the angriest moments that we get to witness from Jesus in the Gospels come because he's fired up about people doing a poor job of welcoming in those who are far from God to come closer to him. Possibly the angriest that we get to witness Jesus get throughout his ministry here on earth, those moments come because people who believe in God are putting up walls and getting in the way of welcoming those who are far from God coming near to him. And possibly what makes Jesus more angry than anything else is walls over welcome. We're going to see that play out in the passage that we're going to look at together today. Go ahead and grab a phone or pull out your Bible. Grab a Bible from the share rack in front of you and flip to Mark chapter 11. It's on page 823 in the Bible that's provided in the chair rack in front of you. And I'll just give you some context as you're headed that way. Jesus has just entered into Jerusalem for what will be the last time. He's just rode into the city on the back of a donkey, and he's welcomed there as Messiah and King. It's traditionally the day that we call Palm Sunday, and it's the Sunday that we celebrate, the Sunday leading up to Easter Sunday in the church. But what this crowd cheering for Jesus didn't know, and Jesus knows for certain, is that in just 6 days, these same people in this crowd are going to be calling for his crucifixion. Like, Jesus knows his decision to enter into Jerusalem would be his demise. And if you look at the pages leading up to Mark chapter 11 in that gospel, you can see Jesus wrestling with this reality. He stops 3 times on this long journey on foot from Philippi, where he is, to Jerusalem, where they're going, to gather up his disciples and say, listen, my decision to enter into Jerusalem will be my death. And he tells them that plainly. And so Jesus enters in to Jerusalem, welcomed as king, and the first place he goes is to the temple. This massive, immaculate structure meant to be the dwelling place of God here on earth, where God promises that his presence will dwell and people can go and worship him there. But as Jesus arrives at the temple, he discovers it looks less like a place of worship and more like a county fair. And the temple courts, right in front of the front doors of the temple, these money changers and these salesmen have set up shop, and they're exchanging Roman currency for temple currency. And they've got these pens set up for sheep and cattle and these cages of doves for people to buy and make sacrifices. And here's what Mark says in chapter 11, starting in verse 15. He says, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of money changers and the benches of those selling doves and would not allow anyone to carry the merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've turned it into a den of robbers? And in case it's not clear in this passage how absolutely irate Jesus is in this moment, the Gospel of John gives us a little bit more context. He says that before Jesus enters into the temple, he takes the time actually to weave together a whip of cords to take into the temple with him. And so when Jesus arrives at the temple, he's not asking politely for people to leave. He has just walked in, weapon in hand, and he's ready to clear the courts by force. And he flips over the tables of the money changers and the people who are selling doves. He opens every pen of cattle and sheep. And I can just kind of picture these salesmen frantically chasing after their product through the city streets, trying to gather it back up again. And it says that Jesus wouldn't even allow people to carry the merchandise that they had purchased through the temple courts. And that's not because Jesus is asking nicely here. It's because he's standing between people in the door, daring them to take another step and see what happens. It's a side of Jesus we don't typically picture, isn't it? And here's how I think we've typically oversimplified this passage. If you've read it before, you've grown up in church at all, that Jesus just doesn't like it when we sell things in church. Like God's house is supposed to be a place of worship and not a marketplace, and it makes Jesus angry when we try to sell something in church. Did anybody else's church use this as an excuse to outlaw bake sales? Nobody else? Okay. Well, I remember doing fundraisers in elementary school, right? Like, and I would get that fundraiser and I would like selling cookies or candy or cookie dough, flour, something like that, right? And every time I would get that fundraiser in hand, I knew, man, I could stand to sell thousands in product. Like I totally could have won that light up scooter. If only my dad would have let me take my little fundraising folder into the church parlor and make my rounds. I mean, I wouldn't have had any competition really. I was one of like 3 kids in my congregation, and we were all siblings. I could have sold to some sweet old church ladies and really cleaned up. But I wasn't allowed to do that because to take the fundraiser into the church would have been making Jesus' house a marketplace, and that was a no-no. But honestly, I think to oversimplify this passage into the message that we just shouldn't sell things in church, it just barely scratches the surface of what made Jesus so mad. In fact, there's an extent to which the people who were selling were providing a legitimate service in what they were selling, right? Like the money changers, they were providing a legitimate service because the people who were coming into the temple to worship, the coins they would have had in their pocket would have been inscribed with the image of Caesar. And so to bring those in to God's presence in the temple would have been paramount with bringing an idol into God's presence. And God's really specific in Exodus. He says that the currency used within the temple should just be these pure silver coins. And in the same way, the people that were selling livestock, they were providing a legitimate service to some. Because some of the people that were coming to worship, they were making a pilgrimage of hundreds of miles, and it wasn't practical or even possible, really, for them to bring with them a sheep or an ox or a dove all that way. So the problem wasn't necessarily that people were selling something in the temple. The problem, part of it at least, was that these people were charging exorbitant prices for the products that they were selling. And the thing is, like, these salesmen weren't setting up this whole operation alone. They were in cahoots with the priests in the temple. And what the priests had done is given these salesmen permission to set up their shop in a prime spot for selling, so long as they got to take a cut of whatever the profit was. You know what this is like? This is like Great American Ballpark in Cincinnati, leasing a storefront to Skyline Chili in the stadium, so long as Skyline promises to share with them a cut of whatever profit they make. But Skyline doesn't want it to cut into their profit margin, do they? And so what do? They inflate the prices, right? To where if you walk into the stadium hungry, you're going to end up getting ripped off and paying $30 for a chili or a coney and a cup of Coke. And this is the exact same thing that was happening in the temple. That the priests, these people that are supposed to be the set apart leaders of God's people, instead of depending on God to meet their needs, they had set up this corrupt system with these salesmen and they were profiting off of it. But here's the thing, I think Jesus would have had just as much to say also to the people who were buying these overpriced products as he would have to those who were selling them. Because when you walk into a ballpark and you have to pay $20 for a cup of Coke, are you really that shocked by it? Are you really that upset? No, right? Like you knew before you ever entered into the stadium, the cost of soda was going to be high. And you could have stopped along the way and filled up on all the food and drink you needed to last you for a few hours through the game. You could have stopped at the store and tried to smuggle something in, or you could have just gone with water, right? But you chose to pay for the overpriced beverage for the sake of convenience. And here's the thing, Jesus' intent, God's intent, was never that his experience of worship and sacrifice in the temple would be convenient for his people. God's desire for his people was not that they would pursue convenience, but compassion. And here's the instruction that God gave his people. That once a year, they would make this journey, this pilgrimage to the temple, and bring with them a spotless lamb, meaning the best looking lamb from their own flock. And the instruction was that they were to choose this lamb as special from birth and set it aside and provide for it special care. It was almost supposed to be like a pet within their own home. And after they had taken the time to lovingly raise it for a year, they were supposed to bring it to the temple together as a family at Passover and sacrifice that beloved, treasured lamb as a family to help them as a community understand the weight of our sin and the cost of forgiveness. That something innocent had to die in their place to shed its blood and cover over the sins that they had committed. And really what God says is, actually, if we want to make a fair value trade here, what I should demand of you is that you come at Passover and you sacrifice your firstborn son. Because then we'd be really getting close to the equal value of the sins that you've committed, the way that it's disrupted our relationship. But God won't violate human life in that way. And so he tells them to bring a spotless lamb in the place of their firstborn son. And he's doing all of this. Man, it was supposed to be an experience that would break their heart, that would fill them with compassion. All to prepare their heart for what God was about to do by giving his own son as the ultimate sacrifice for sin. That he was going to give up his own son to shed his blood and have the sins of the world covered over so that all people could come closer to him. And instead, what God's people had done is take what was supposed to be this deeply meaningful act of worship and pursue convenience over compassion. They were willing to pay $20 for the cup of Coke for the sake of convenience and to cut emotions out of it. And man, I think it begs the question of us, in what ways can we evaluate our own lives and our own faith and recognize areas where we are pursuing convenience over true compassion in a heart of worship? But you know what? We talked through this whole process, this whole corrupt system of buying and selling, and we haven't even gotten to what really made Jesus mad. Because the thing that really ticked Jesus off, the straw that broke the camel's back, it was not necessarily what these people were doing, what they're buying and selling, but it was where they had this whole operation set up. You see, because Mark says that these salesmen had set up shop in the temple courts. And the proper name for that place was actually called the Court of Gentiles. It was meant to be this place where all people of the earth, set aside for all people of the earth to come and worship God close to his presence. Because even though the Jews only could enter into the temple itself as a part of God's chosen people, that didn't mean that God wasn't calling all people back to faith and a relationship with him. And God tells us what this is supposed to look like in Isaiah chapter 56. He says, listen, I don't want any foreigner to be able to say that God has excluded me from his people. He says, even foreigners should be able to come and worship me at my temple and bring a sacrifice to me as an act of worship. And then God says through Isaiah, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. And so when Jesus walks into the temple on Palm Sunday to clear it out, he's quoting the words of God himself and trying to call God's people back to their mission. Because the temple courts, the court of Gentiles, was meant to be a sacred place where you could come and experience God's presence even if you weren't a part of the Jewish nation. And I think a picture of the temple helps us to better understand how this all looked and picture how this all went down. Here's what the temple looked like back in Jesus' day, a simple diagram. Okay, in the very middle of the temple, you had this place called the Holy of Holies. And it was the place where the actual, literal presence of God was promised to dwell. God said, I will make my home among my people. But there was only one person that was allowed to enter into the actual presence of God and advocate for the entire world on their behalf before God, and it was the high priest. And even then, he was only able to enter into the actual presence of God after sacrificing a series of sacrifices and taking part in all these purification practices to make sure that he was purified of sin before he entered into God's presence. And then outside of the Holy of Holies, the place where the actual presence of God dwelled, you had this court of Israel. And it was a place where Jews, God's chosen people, could get a little bit closer to God's presence than anybody else. But still not so close that like God's holiness and perfection would cause them to just drop dead in their mess, like a scene out of Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know what I'm saying? And then outside of the temple itself, you had the court of Gentiles. And it was meant to be a place where all people of the earth, regardless of their race, could come and worship God, could get closer to his presence and bring him sacrifices and worship him there. Because here's what you have to understand. The Jews were God's chosen people, but God's intent was never that only the Jewish people would come to faith and a relationship with him. In fact, from the moment that God calls his people and rescues his people from slavery in Egypt, he tells them, listen, I am choosing you and I want to use you to be messengers to the rest of the world about who I am. That's the mission I'm giving you. He says in Exodus 19, right after Israel has walked out of Egypt, he said, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you out on eagle's wings and I brought you to myself. Now, if you'll obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God rescued his people from Egypt and set them apart for the purpose of representing God to all people, calling all people back to faith and a relationship with him. And if I'm starting to lose you in all this history and temple talk, just check back in with me for a second. I'm going to simplify it all right here. What made Jesus so angry is that God's chosen people, tasked with making him known to all people of the earth, had turned their faith into an exclusive club. And they thought that their relationship with God was just for them to keep to themselves and be so special. And it got to its worst point in the temple because they took this place that was supposed to be a place of welcome for the outsider, and they turned it into a place where only the insider profited. Jesus was angry enough to pick up a whip because God's chosen people had taken what was supposed to be a place of worship and welcome, and they turned it into a Walmart. And honestly, I think that if I was a Gentile today, and I tried to go and worship God in his temple, if I believed that God was the one true God, but I wasn't Jewish, I would have arrived at the temple with a sacrifice in hand, ready to give a sacrifice to God and spend some time in prayer and worship, only to discover arriving on the temple that there was no one there standing at the ready to take my sacrifice for me further in and sacrifice it before God. And that the place of prayer didn't exist for me because it had been turned into a marketplace. And it fired up the heart of Jesus because God's chosen people had turned their faith into an exclusive club. And they weren't giving any thought to the outsider. And this place that should have been a place of welcome for all people became a place where they had put up walls. And honestly, I think this is the potential pitfall of any institution. That any institution has the potential to drift off of mission and take it to a place where it's actually accomplishing like the opposite of what its original intent or foundation was for. Right? McDonald's is a really good example of this. Did you know that McDonald's was founded originally by two brothers? Dick and Mac McDonald's. And when they first opened their first McDonald's location in San Bernardino, California, they had no interest at all in franchising. They had developed this system that could provide the customer with a highly efficient, incredibly precise, high-quality meal that they didn't have to wait on. And their mission as they set out was to serve their customer in a way that no other restaurant at the time could. But when Ray Kroc discovered the McDonald brothers and the system that they had set up, his only thought was how he could exploit that to make a profit for himself. And so he started out by convincing them to let him open a second location. And then from there, he wrote them out of their business and he stole it from them and developed the massive franchise company that we know as McDonald's today. The original slogan of McDonald's, written by the McDonald brothers, was excellence in every burger. That's not what it is anymore, is it? What is it now? Billions and billions served. That's what they put on their board outside their buildings. And what was originally designed with the mission to be a place to provide the individual high-quality experience, it became more about the billions they could profit from. Another really good example of this is the most elite colleges and universities in our nation today. Did you know that the most elite institutions, educational institutions like Harvard and Yale, they were originally founded as Bible colleges for the purpose of training Christian leaders? Did you know this? Harvard University, arguably the most prestigious and elite institution in America today, it was originally founded by Puritans in 1636 for the purpose of training Christian leaders. This comes right out of Harvard's precepts from the time that the school was written. This is what they wrote. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies, to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and to therefore lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation for all sound knowledge and learning. Their original motto was Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae, truth for Christ and his church. But as they began to develop more degree programs and grow in notoriety throughout the years, they drifted from a place for the common man to be trained in Christian service, and they became a place where only the elite belonged. And now I'd argue that as an institution, there's no resemblance at all to being a place for plain instruction built on the foundation of Christ. It's a place where the wisdom of God is disregarded as foolish. And Yale, a group of believers founded Yale because they thought Harvard had drifted off mission. The same is true for Columbia and Princeton and on down the list. And if an institution isn't careful, it can begin to drift off mission and accomplish the opposite of its original intent. This is exactly what happened in the temple system. That God's chosen people, tasked with making him known, had turned their faith into an exclusive club. And they completely disregarded the outsider. And what was meant to be a place of prayer for all nations became a marketplace and a den of thieves. I mean, I think the question we have to ask as a church today then is, in what ways do we risk drifting from our mission? Man, in what ways do we risk showing up to this place week after week thinking that the purpose of being here is to benefit ourselves? In what ways do we show up to this place and pursue convenience over compassion and a true heart of worship? In what ways do we take on the McDonald's mindset and of billions and billions served, and we think, man, we really pack them in on a Sunday, but we neglect the call to lead the one into a personal encounter and a deeper relationship with the Lord? In what ways do we go the opposite direction and become more like Harvard and Yale, where we turn a place meant for the outsider and a place that's supposed to be a place of welcome into a place where only the elites belong? How can we be sure not to drift off our mission as a church? And I'll just remind you of what our mission is. It's to get lost people saved, saved people pastored, pastored people trained, and trained people mobilized to go and reach lost people. And we get that mission from the words of Christ himself, because here is what Jesus did when he died on the cross. He abolished the old temple system. And now no longer is your place, is the status of being God's chosen people based on race, but now it's based on faith. And if you believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the Son of God, sent to save you from your sins, then through faith in him, you are afforded a personal relationship with God that changes everything. But it's not just something that you're supposed to hoard to yourself. The call then placed on your life is that you would be a new priesthood, tasked with making the whole world know who Jesus is. This is what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2. He says this about you and me. Now, if we claim to believe in Jesus, that we are God's chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, who's called to declare the praises of him who has called us out of darkness and into his wonderful light. And if we claim to believe in Jesus, then we are called to be the new priesthood. And I'll just ask then, if we are the new priesthood, man, in what ways do we risk falling into the same pitfalls as the old one? And is it at all possible that Jesus, peering in on our church, would say that our church lobby looks a whole lot like the temple courts? That when an outsider walks into this place for the first time, they see a lot of people going about their business and huddled up talking and rushing to get to a serving role or a small group or grab a cup of coffee and snag a seat in service, but they could walk through an entire Sunday and not be welcomed by any of those people in a particular way. Is it possible that we're falling into the same pitfalls? Is it ever possible that an outsider would walk through the doors of this place and encounter walls in what should be a place of welcome? And I think the question for each of us personally has to be, if we claim to believe in Jesus and we call Bethany our church home, then how can each of us personally take on the call to go out of our way to knock down any wall that stands in the place of welcome in this place? How can we go out of our way to remove any barrier we see that is holding people back from being able to access a relationship with God that will change everything? And I'll tell you where God convicted me on this personally as I was writing these words, that, man, I need to be way more diligent about asking people their name and calling them by name on a Sunday morning. Like, I recognize that in a big place like Bethany, even after being here for a few years, there are still so many people who I don't know. I've never even taken the time to learn their name. And there's people who I really should know, who I see every Sunday in a lobby or I see out in the community, but I've never taken the time to introduce myself in a particular way. And man, honestly, like, that's not just a call for us who are pastors here on staff. If you claim to believe in Jesus and you would say, this is your church home, then how can you go out of your way to take ownership of this place and make people feel welcome? Man, how much more of a place of welcome could Bethany stand to be if each of us would choose to just have eyes to see the people we typically walk right past on a Sunday morning? Especially on a week like next week, where we're going to see hundreds more people than normal come through our doors. And I bet you there are going to be people that come into this place next Saturday and Sunday, and they fully intend to sneak in and out of a service without anybody knowing they were here. How could we stand to shock just one of those people, or half of those people, if all of us would individually take on the call to catch somebody we don't recognize in the lobby or haven't seen in a long time, and take the time to introduce ourselves or tell them that we're glad to see them? Man, how could that alone stand to increase their chances of coming back to this place next week, or asking more questions, or taking steps of faith? And maybe it goes beyond a simple introduction, and it goes into an invitation and deeper community around here. Maybe it's about going beyond the invitation and having the boldness and the ownership to invite somebody to join you for lunch after service on a Sunday, or invite them to grab coffee with you throughout the week. And it's for the same reason that you hear so often from this platform, that the purpose in you showing up every Sunday is not just for you to consume a service and to leave. And you're called to be a part of something bigger than yourself and to take on a serving role and be a part of a community group or a small group. That's not just for you. Although I believe God has something for all of us in that, as we lean into the ways that he's gifted us and we live our life, our faith in a community, and we don't do it alone, man, God has something for us in that. But ultimately, the call to do more than consume at church is not about you. It's about the outsider that you could stand to impact. And I don't mean to be overly critical here. That's not my intent at all. I love Bethany Christian Church. And I believe wholeheartedly we are a church that is living on mission. I love that I get to see every week people walk into this place and encounter God for the first time and experience life change in that. I'm just saying, man, it's never wrong to continue to ask hard questions and challenge ourselves to continue to more boldly live out the mission that God has given us. Because honestly, the stakes are too high. And we have been called by Christ to be a force to be reckoned with, that knocks down the very gates of hell and finds people freedom who have been stuck in darkness and sin, invites them into a relationship with Jesus that changes everything. And if we're talking about being more and more a place of welcome, then I want to challenge you again that all of this begins with a bold invitation. Who is God tugging on your heart right now, who you know that person is living outside of the light of Christ, and I need to be the one to invite them closer to him? And then how can you go beyond the simple invitation and lead that one into a deeper relationship, a personal encounter with God, and into the community of his church in a way that changes everything? Will you pray with me? God, I praise you for who you are. That you have placed on us an incredible, fulfilling purpose in this life. And God, I understand how intimidating it can be to make the introduction or the invitation. But God, I pray that you would help us to realize that the call that you've placed on our lives, you're not calling us to pursue it by our own strength, but that you have placed inside of us your own Spirit, that the Spirit of the living God is at work in us, using us to fulfill his good purpose. God, give us boldness and confidence in you. Give us ownership over your church so that we might seek and save those who are furthest from you. God, I pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.